The silence of the church was broken by the abrupt sound of a pew scraping. All eyes turned to the front, where the millionaire, in an impeccable suit and trembling hands, stared at the bride with an expression like someone who had just seen a ghost. His breathing became heavy, sweat dripping down his forehead as his attention shifted to the back of the hall. There, in the shadow of the columns, she stood, the maid, motionless, her eyes brimming with tears, dressed simply, but carrying an invisible weight that seemed to hold even the air. A shiver ran down the guests' spines, for in that instant it became clear that the ceremony would not follow the script everyone expected. Something deep, ancient, and unspeakable had been awakened, and no one knew for sure what would come next. He took a step back as if needing distance to understand what was before him. The audience murmured, a mix of curiosity and discomfort, until the millionaire raised his hand and signaled for the priest to stop. His gaze remained fixed on the silent figure at the back of the church, and in that instant, the fate of 3 lives hung in the balance. The pale bride clutched the bouquet until it crushed the flowers, unsure whether she was about to be humiliated or protected. The maid, for her part, seemed to know exactly the reason for that look, a buried secret rising from the past like a ghost demanding justice. When he finally opened his mouth, the words that came out were unexpected by no one. And what happened next would forever change the way everyone in that town would talk about love, loyalty, and silent revenge. If this story has you hooked this far, you need to hear the ending. So, leave a like and subscribe now. The cold New York wind sliced through the streets like invisible blades that Sunday morning, but inside the church, the warmth of the golden chandeliers and the sweet scent of flowers created an almost suffocating contrast. Guests arrived impeccably dressed, their whispers thick with curiosity about the engagement of the most talked-about man in town. Richard Davenport, heir to a fortune built over 3 generations, was about to join his name with that of the traditional and influential Campbell family, sealing not only a loving commitment, but also a powerful agreement between 2 dynasties. Soft organ music filled the room, while the bride, Victoria Campbell, stood in the sacristy, surrounded by bridesmaids and photographers, adjusting her veil that shimmered like snow in the golden light. She smiled, but her gaze strayed to the clock, as if counting every second before entering. Outside, Richard walked down the aisle greeting a few guests, his impeccable posture hiding the tension building beneath the surface. No one imagined that, just a few meters away, between marble columns and polished wooden benches, someone was silently watching. The maid, Helena, was there by chance or by a calling she couldn't even explain. She wasn't on the guest list. She wasn't wearing expensive clothes or jewelry. She wore only the simplicity of a faded blue dress and a look that carried an entire story. As the first chords of "Here Comes the Bride" echoed, Richard positioned himself beside the altar. His eyes scanned the audience absently, until they landed on a figure who shouldn't have been there. It was at that moment that the world seemed to shrink. The hubbub faded, and the sound of the organ became a distant hum. Something in his chest tightened, a mixture of shock and recognition, as if years of silence and oblivion were crashing down on his memory all at once. The past he thought he had buried stood upright at the back of the church, and breathed. Richard blinked rapidly, as if he could banish the image with a simple flick of his eyelids. But Helena remained there, motionless, her face illuminated by a sliver of light filtering through the stained glass windows. It wasn't just her presence that disturbed him. It was what she represented, a chapter of his life he had sworn never to revisit. His fingers began to tingle, and the tie that had once seemed an elegant adornment now became a noose tightening around his neck. The priest, oblivious to the gathering turmoil, began the first words of the ceremony, his voice echoing through the hall as if each syllable carried the weight of a sentence. The guests smiled, some whispered discreetly, unaware that the facade of perfection was beginning to crack. Helena, for her part, didn't look away. Her deep, unwavering brown eyes were fixed on him as if trying to extract a long-hidden truth. She didn't move, but her presence was almost physical, as if the air around her had a density of its own. Richard felt sweat trickle down the back of his neck, and a pang of anger mingled with fear. Why had she come? What was she up to? Was it coincidence or a calculated act to appear right there, in front of everyone, at the most important and most vulnerable moment of his life? Victoria entered through the main door with her impeccable smile, but even her beauty seemed to fade before the silent storm gathering at the altar. Richard, trying to hide it, stretched his lips into a tight smile, but his eyes continued to wander to the back of the church. Helena didn't move, but there was something in her straight shoulders and lifted chin that spoke louder than any gesture. He remembered, in quick flashes, nights spent in his family mansion, when Helena was still just a servant, but a servant who carried secrets, secrets that could destroy not only the marriage but also his name, his reputation, and the entire empire he had inherited. Each step Victoria took down the aisle was like a hammering in his chest. The guests stared at the bride in awe, unaware that the groom was about to lose control. When she finally reached the altar, the priest asked everyone to be seated. Richard turned to take her hand, but his eyes involuntarily strayed back to Helena. And it was at that moment that he saw what she held in her hands. A small white envelope, crumpled at the edges, as if it had been kept for a long time. His heart raced. He knew that envelope. He knew exactly what was written inside, and the weight those words carried. The air in the church felt heavier, as if every speck of dust dancing in the golden light was a reminder of the past he wished to erase. Richard tried to focus on the priest's words, but they sounded distant, muffled, as if coming from another room. What truly mattered was just a few feet away, compressed inside a white envelope he knew better than he cared. The last time he had seen that paper, the circumstances had been very different. There had been tears, there had been promises, and there had been a raw pain he had cowardly chosen to ignore. Helena didn't blink. Her stillness was almost inhuman, as if anchored to the ground by a greater purpose. With every second, Richard remembered fragments, her laughter in the mansions kitchen, the smell of coffee in the morning, the look she'd lingered on him when he thought no one was looking. Sweet memories until everything fell apart. There was something he'd done, something that had crossed an invisible line and turned affection into resentment. And now, years later, that resentment was clothed in silence and stood before him in full ceremony, with all eyes ready to witness any deviation. Victoria adjusted her veil, noticing his distraction. Her eyes sought his, but he looked away, pretending to observe the guests. He felt the weight of his lie grow. The bride didn't know, no one knew, at least no one in that church except Helena. Her presence was like a constant whisper in his ear, repeating that the truth always finds a way to emerge, no matter how many walls of luxury and influence are erected. When the priest asked the bride and groom to join hands, Richard felt Victoria's cool skin against his. It was with that contact that a thought crossed his mind. If Helena opened that envelope, nothing would remain. The prestige, the respect, even the image of a philanthropist he had so zealously cultivated, all would crumble to dust. And there was more. The contents of that letter not only compromised him, but also brought to light something that could forever tarnish his family's name. From the back of the church, Helena inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging the uneasiness she provoked. It was a tiny gesture, but to Richard it sounded like a sentence. He knew this wasn't a coincidence. She had a plan, and he was about to discover it along with everyone there. A gentle wind blew through the open church door, gently ruffling Helena's simple dress. It was as if the outside world wanted to invade that solemn moment, reminding her that life doesn't bow to perfect ceremonies. Richard, however, sensed that the breeze carried more than air. It carried with it the harbinger of something irreversible. Helena took a step forward, almost imperceptible to the more distracted, but enough for his gaze to involuntarily lock onto her. Her fingers gripped the envelope firmly, like someone cradling a silent weapon, and there was a sharp glint in her eyes that wasn't there to ask for mercy. The priest continued to conduct the ritual, his deep voice echoing off the high ceiling, but Richard could no longer hear anything. Each word of blessing mingled with the rushing sound of his own heart. His mind returned to that night, years ago, When an argument tore through the halls of the mansion, Helena wept, begging to be heard, but he, driven by pride, fear, or sheer cowardice, chose to turn his back. The next morning she was gone, taking with her a silence that now shattered with her mere presence. Victoria noticed his tension. His smile began to falter, and his grip tightened as if he sensed something unscripted was about to happen. The guests, still engrossed in the beauty of the ceremony, were oblivious to the electrical wire, connecting the groom to the figure in the background. But for Richard, that wire was about to transform into a current capable of dragging him into an abyss. Helena took another step, now visible to some. A lady in the last row frowned, glancing back and forth between her and her fiancé. It was the beginning of a domino effect. Within seconds, whispers began to spread like tiny sparks, fueling a collective curiosity. Helena, however, didn't seem to mind. She kept her gaze fixed on Richard, as if time were just a detail, and she had waited years for this moment. It was then that he realized she wasn't there just to remind him of the past. She was there to expose it. Maybe not in front of everyone, yet, but the way her hands protected the envelope indicated that the moment of revelation would be chosen with surgical precision. He didn't know if it would be now, in the middle of the vows, or later, when everyone had relaxed from the party. The only certainty was that she wouldn't leave, without accomplishing what she had come to do. Helena took a deep breath, as if absorbing all the air in the room, and her footsteps echoed softly on the polished wooden floor. They weren't long strides, but they had a measured weight, enough for Richard to know she wasn't about to back down. He tried to maintain his composure, tightening his grip on Victoria's hand, but the sweat on his palms betrayed him. The priest continued to speak of commitment, loyalty, and true love, words that now felt like knives spinning inside him. Helena approached one end of the central nave, a few meters from the nearest row of guests. She pretended to find a seat, but her true intention was different, to make her every move noticed. A lady in an elegant hat watched her curiously, whispering something in her husband's ear, who soon followed her with his gaze. It was as if Helena were lighting matches around a powder keg, discreet, but enough for everyone to begin to smell the smoke. Richard quickly looked away, trying to pretend nothing was happening, but the magnetism of her presence drew him back. Every time his gaze met hers, he felt the weight of everything he had tried to bury. It was as if Helena were undressing him in front of everyone, without touching him, without saying a single word. Just by existing there with that envelope, she was destroying the walls he had built over the years. Victoria, noticing her fiancé's lack of focus, squeezed his hand and forced a smile for the cameras. But deep down her instinct screamed that something was wrong, very wrong. She discreetly followed his gaze and saw Helena. He didn't recognize her immediately, but her posture, the way she stood erect, as if she had every right to be there, stirred a silent unease. It was then that Helena made her first calculated move. She slowly removed the envelope from her bag and placed it on the bench nearby, where it could be seen by passers-by. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, but it was enough to send a chill down Richard's spine. It was a warning, a reminder that the contents of that envelope were just one step away from becoming public. The priest asked the bride and groom to look into each other's eyes as they repeated their vows. Richard tried, but he couldn't keep his focus on Victoria's face. The image of Helena, motionless and impassive, remained etched in his mind. He knew he was losing control of the situation, and when Helena lightly touched the envelope, as if caressing it, he understood that this was only the first piece moved in a game she intended to win. Richard repeated the priest's words with a cracking voice, as if caught between swallowing and suppressing a tremor. The cameras captured every expression, every tiny detail of a face that should have been serene, but now brimmed with unease. The cameraman, uncomprehending, adjusted the focus to better capture the groom's emotion, believing it to be typical nervousness. Little did he know he was documenting the beginnings of a breakdown. Victoria's hand, once steady, began to sweat. She felt something slipping from her control, a subtle instinct telling her the man before her wasn't thinking about their future, but about something else, or someone else. She risked another glance toward the back of the church and found Helena again. This time, he noticed the envelope. A pang of unease rose in her chest. Who was this woman? And why did Richard, always so confident, seem to crumble at the mere sight of her? The tension didn't go unnoticed by the guests. Two of Victoria's cousins exchanged glances and hushed comments. A business friend of Richard's, seated nearer, leaned forward discreetly to observe what was holding the groom's attention. Whispers began to spread, gaining small layers of speculation. Someone suggested she was an ex-girlfriend. Another, more daring, whispered that she might be someone with dangerous stories to tell. Meanwhile, Helena remained impassive. There was no trace of haste in her gestures. She knew the wait was part of the coup, that every second increased the pressure on Richard. Her fingers rested on the envelope, as if protecting a treasure or a sentence. Richard noticed the suspicious glances and felt his throat tighten. His posture began to lose its practiced rigidity. His right shoulder leaned forward slightly, his head lowered, and he began avoiding eye contact with anyone, as if hiding were possible. But the worst was yet to come. When the priest asked him to say the yes that would seal the vows, the word stuck. It was only 2 seconds of silence, but it felt eternal. The murmur grew louder. Victoria looked at him, confused, and tightened her grip on his hand, as if trying to extract the commitment by force. He, in an almost involuntary reflex, glanced at Helena again. She then arched an eyebrow, a simple gesture, but one that carried a silent threat. Richard finally said, yes, but it wasn't the same. The sound came out hoarse, lacking the strength everyone had expected. He knew Helena had won that moment without moving a single visible piece, and worse, everyone in the church now wanted to know who she was. The sound of Helena's shoes against the polished floor echoed like a slow drumbeat, breaking the solemn cadence of the ceremony. Her steps weren't quick nor timid, they were precise, charged with intention, as if every inch she advanced was calculated to prolong the tension. The guests began to turn their heads, following her silent movement, and soon a trail of murmurs spread throughout the central aisle. Richard tried to steal his expression, but the slight tremor in his jaw betrayed him. He knew that with each step she took, the distance between him and the past diminished. And when the past decides to sit right in front of you, there's no pretending it doesn't exist. Victoria, feeling the atmosphere shift, took a slight step back, still unsure if this was an invasion or a mistake. But something in her already recognized the danger there, a danger not measured in weapons or screams, but in the power of a truth held back for too long. Helena didn't hurry her pace. Her simple dress swayed gently with each step, and the envelope remained clutched tightly in her hands. There was no rush because she knew what mattered was the impact. Nearing the halfway point of the aisle, she paused for a moment, watching Richard as if searching for any trace of regret, and he, motionless, felt as if he were standing before a silent courtroom, with dozens of jurors watching the scene, ready to react at any sign. Some guests whispered names, trying to guess who the woman was. Others simply watched, fascinated by the unfolding drama. A photographer, sensing something extraordinary was happening, adjusted his lens and framed Helena amid the church's golden backdrop. That image would be etched in memory, and not just on camera. The priest, noticing the unusual movement, hesitated for a brief second, but continued with the ceremony, trying to maintain order. However, the tension was already uncontrollable. The silence between words seemed heavier, denser, and each new sentence was lost in the growing hubbub. It was at that moment that Helena did something subtle but devastating. She lifted the envelope slightly, enough so that Richard knew it could be opened at any moment. He felt his entire body stiffen. It was no longer just the memory of a mistake. It was the knowledge that this mistake was about to become public. Victoria looked at him and noticed the change in his breathing. It wasn't ordinary nervousness, it was fear. And in that moment, she understood that whatever history they had was about to be revealed at the altar. When Helena took 3 more steps, there was no longer any way to ignore her. She was close enough that Richard felt her presence like a cold shadow within arm's reach. The air around them seemed thin, and even the sound of the organ, which continued to play, softly became distant, almost irrelevant. The guests were no longer just whispering. They were leaning in for a better look, driven by an almost primal instinct to witness a moment they knew would be remembered forever. Richard tried to keep his eyes fixed on the priest, but the weight of Helena's gaze pulled him like a magnet. He could see the details of her face, the small lines at the corners of her eyes, the firmness of her lips that didn't tremble. She didn't come to plead or ask. She came to demand. And that struck him in a way no business enemy or political rival ever had. Victoria, increasingly uncomfortable, briefly released his hand. She could no longer maintain the act. Her groom's body was tense, his gaze lost, and sweat glistened on his skin under the golden light of the church. Everything in her screamed to ask who that woman was, but the presence of photographers, families, and all of New York society prevented her from reacting as she would have liked. When Helena stopped just a few feet from the altar, she inclined her head slightly and, with an almost imperceptible gesture, opened the envelope just enough to reveal that it did indeed contain something. Richard felt heat rise to his face, as if all his veins were on fire at once. The muffled sound of a collective gasp rippled through the church. He wasn't the only one who sensed something serious was about to happen. The priest, now visibly disturbed by the scene, paused for a second in his reading of the vows and looked at Richard, as if seeking a decision. The millionaire, however, didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the partially revealed piece of paper, a symbol of everything he had tried to bury, and which, at that moment, was about to emerge with destructive force. It was at that moment that Helena struck the first visible blow. She raised the envelope to chest height and held it with both hands, staring directly at him. She didn't say a word, but the message was clear. She was in control. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the organ stopped, as if the musician himself had sensed that the moment demanded absolute attention. Richard swallowed hard, feeling the world spin around him. For the first time in years, he realized he had no power in this situation, and this, in front of the entire town gathered, was the first moment his facade began to crumble. The silence that hung over the church was no longer respectful, but tense, almost electric. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm, where everyone senses something is about to happen, but no one knows exactly how. Helena took another step, now so close that Richard could smell the subtle perfume she always wore, a light jasmine scent that, years ago, had mingled with memories of nights when the world seemed simpler and less cruel. This detail, however small, cut him inside like a blade, because it proved she was there not just to expose, but to remind him. Unhurriedly, Helena slid her finger under the envelope's flap and began to open it completely. The soft sound of the paper releasing echoed like thunder in Richard's mind. He couldn't take his eyes off the gesture, as if hypnotized. It was a slow, deliberate, almost cruel movement, and every second of that opening increased the feeling that all the air had been sucked from the room. The guests were now completely focused on her. Even those unfamiliar with the story instinctively sensed they were about to witness something no one would forget. One of the photographers, sensing the importance of the moment, positioned himself to capture the scene, while the audience's murmur grew louder with each passing second. Victoria, feeling something completely out of her control, took a step aside, moving slightly away from Richard. Her mind was ablaze with questions, but she lacked the courage to break protocol and demand answers. Her face was beginning to drain of color, and the radiant bridal glow was replaced by a cold tension. Helena kept the envelope open, but didn't remove its contents. Instead, she held it steady, tilting it slightly, just enough for Richard to see that there, indeed, were those words he'd feared. She knew she didn't need to read them for their weight to be felt. She just needed to show she could, and that somehow was even more devastating. The priest cleared his throat, trying to resume the ceremony, but his voice faltered. The moment no longer belonged to him, nor to the bride and groom. It belonged to Helena, and everyone knew it. Richard instinctively took a step forward as if reaching for the envelope, but the distance between them, physical and emotional, was greater than any church aisle. Helena stood firm, her gaze impenetrable, like a judge waiting for the exact moment to pronounce sentence. And then she slowly moved the envelope toward her purse, not to put it away, but to convey that she could take it out again whenever she wanted. There was no rush, because her greatest weapon wasn't the paper. It was time. Richard no longer heard the priest's words. Every beat of his own heart sounded louder than any voice, and every look cast in his direction felt like an accusation. The open envelope remained in Helena's hand, like an object both sacred and cursed. Its mere presence, with its contents known only to the two of them, was a constant threat that suffocated every breath. Victoria watched him with a confused and increasingly wounded expression. There was no hiding it anymore. The groom wasn't fully there. The man before her seemed to be struggling against something no one could see, except Helena. The bride clutched the bouquet tightly, as if she could cling to some stability, but the flowers began to lose petals under the pressure. Then Helena took another step. Now she was just a few feet from the altar. It was enough for some of the more impulsive guests to lean forward, as if they were about to stand up, anxious to see what would happen. The nearest photographer positioned himself to capture not only her face, but also Richard's in the same frame, a contrast between calm and storm. Richard felt his breath catch in his throat. The priest's words, asking him to confirm the vows again, sounded like a distant echo. He couldn't respond. His silence was so thick that the music stopped, the murmurs ceased, and everyone waited for his reaction. And it was in this emptiness that Helena slightly lifted the envelope, tilting it so that the golden light from the chandeliers revealed a piece of paper inside. Richard recognized the handwriting immediately, and that sight was the trigger. His body moved before he could think. He took 2 steps forward, releasing Victoria's hand, which she instinctively recoiled from. The priest tried to say something, but Richard raised his hand abruptly, signaling silence. His eyes were fixed solely on Helena, and the tension in his muscles betrayed that he couldn't continue the ceremony as if nothing were happening. "Enough," he said, his voice firm but filled with controlled anger. A murmur ran through the church. No one knew if that enough was for Helena, for the ceremony, or for something much deeper that everyone was about to discover. Helena didn't back down. She simply tilted her chin slightly upward, as if accepting a challenge. The atmosphere transformed from silent tension to pulsating anticipation. Everyone knew that from then on, nothing would ever be the same again. The echo of the word enough still vibrated between the marble columns when a profound silence fell over the church. It wasn't a silence of respect, but of absolute shock, as if everyone had simultaneously held their breath. The priest, paralyzed, still held the open book, unsure whether to continue or make room for what was about to happen. Victoria, pale and motionless, felt the ground beneath her feet loosen. It wasn't just the interruption that affected her, but the way Richard looked at that woman at the back of the nave, a look that carried a weight she'd never seen before. Helena took another step forward, and this time there was no disguise. The sound of her shoes echoed on the polished wood like an announcement. Holding the envelope at chest height, she scanned every face before settling back on Richard. There was no rush, but there was no hesitation either. She knew all eyes were already on her, and that every second of silence only increased the tension. "Don't worry, Richard," Helena said, her voice low but clear enough to carry to the back row. "I'm not here to ruin your day, at least not in the way you think." The murmur was immediate. Some shifted in their seats, others leaned forward, as if afraid to miss a word. Victoria, unable to control her impulse, took a step toward Helena, but Richard held up his arm to stop her. He wasn't sure exactly what Helena would say, but he was certain he didn't want his fiancée to intervene. "I came because, before you seal what you're about to do, you need to remember what you promised me," she continued, each word like a perfectly measured drop of poison, "and what you did after breaking that promise." Richard felt the weight of dozens of eyes turn to him. Each syllable was a thin blade, cutting not only through the mask he wore but also through the image he had cultivated in society. The priest, clearly uncomfortable, glanced at one of the attendants, hoping someone would take control of the situation, but no one dared interrupt. Helen then held up the envelope as if it were irrefutable proof. Inside is a memory of a man I once thought I knew. She didn't open the paper. He simply held it suspended in midair, as if the act of showing it would be enough to shake Richard to his core. Victoria, her voice trembling, finally broke the silence. "Who are you?" The question hung in the air, thick with suspicion and anger. Helena smiled but didn't answer. Instead, she took another step toward the altar, and everyone felt the revelation was just a breath away. The sound of Helena's footsteps against the polished floor was now the only rhythm dominating the church. Each beat felt like a blow to Richard's heart, which remained motionless, even though his entire body screamed for escape. She crossed the central aisle like someone traveling the last stretch of a long road, unhurried but with a clear destination. Her simple dress swayed gently, and the light from the chandeliers reflected off the strands of her hair, making her even more impossible to ignore. When she reached the base of the steps leading to the altar, Helena stopped. The space between her and Richard felt like an invisible boundary, fraught with memories and guilt that only they understood. The priest, restless, took a step back, as if recognizing that the moment was no longer his. Victoria, standing nearby, felt the bouquet slip from her hands, and the dry sound of falling petals echoed louder than it should have. Helena lifted the envelope delicately, as if carrying a fragile object. "I kept this for years," she said, her voice low but sharp. "Not out of revenge, but because I knew one day you would need to remember." Richard felt the blood rush to his face. His gaze, once cold, now trembled. He knew exactly what was inside that paper, and knew that if it were revealed there would be nothing left to save. Memories came flooding back. Nights in the mansion, secrets exchanged in the half-light, whispered promises, never kept. And then, the silent betrayal he pretended not to see but which he carried with him until that day. The guests were mesmerized. No one dared move. One or two adjusted their posture on the bench, but everyone kept their eyes fixed on the triangle of tension between Richard, Helena, and Victoria. "You told me that certain truths were too dangerous for the world," Helena continued, "but you forgot that the danger lies not in the truth, but in the lie that sustains it." The words fell like stones on Richard's heart. It was impossible not to understand the message. He had built his entire life on a fragile foundation, and now that foundation was about to crumble before everyone's eyes. Victoria, her breath quickening, finally took a step forward, approaching Helena. "I want to know," she said, her voice thick with determination and anger. "I want to know now." Helena looked at her appraisingly, then turned her gaze to Richard, as if the fate of the revelation depended solely on him. But deep down, everyone knew the decision had already been made, and that, in the next moment, nothing could stop what was hidden in that envelope from coming to light. Helena climbed the first step of the altar with the calm of someone carrying a destiny, not a secret. Richard took a step back, as if the physical proximity were enough to increase the emotional weight already crushing him. The envelope remained in her hands, intact, but everyone could feel its contents pulsating like a bomb about to explode. "I didn't come to destroy you, Richard," Helena said, her voice firm but not shouting. "I came so you would remember what it took to get here, and so she," Helena inclined her head slightly toward Victoria, "would know who she's marrying." Richard closed his eyes for a moment. It was as if he wanted to erase everything, but when he opened them, he saw not only Helena before him, but also all the faces fixed on him, waiting, and in that moment, he knew there was no more room for escape. Helena then opened the envelope completely. The sound of paper ripping filled the air. She didn't read the words. She simply removed a yellowed photograph and held it up for all to see. In the image, a younger Richard, sitting in the mansion's library, embraced Helena from behind. On the table were signed documents and a check worth enough to change anyone's life. In the corner of the photo, handwritten, read, "For what you promised and never fulfilled." A murmur swept through the church like a sudden wind. Victoria recoiled, her face filled with disbelief and humiliation. It wasn't just the intimacy of the image, but evidence that Richard had tried to buy Helena's silence years ago and failed. The money hadn't bought oblivion, It had merely postponed the moment of reckoning. Richard took a step forward, as if to take the photo from her hands, but Helena quickly backed away, shielding it as if protecting history itself. "You wanted me to disappear," she said. "And now?" There was emotion in her voice, but no tears. "And I did. But what you did didn't take me away." The priest lowered his head, visibly uncomfortable, and some guests began to stand, unsure whether to leave or watch the drama unfold. Victoria, teary-eyed, held out her hand to Helena. "Give me this," she asked, her tone softer than anyone expected. Helena studied her for a few seconds, then handed over the photo. Victoria looked at the image carefully, as if weighing every detail, and then, to everyone's surprise, she placed it on the altar and left it there. There was no flash of anger, no harsh words, just a cold, calculated gesture. She removed the ring from her finger and placed it next to the photo. Without looking at Richard, she walked down the aisle and out of the church, her dress trailing like a silent trail of dignity. The silence was absolute. Helena put the envelope back and turned to leave. Before crossing the threshold, however, she looked over her shoulder and said, "What you lose today is only what you built on lies. The rest was never yours." Richard remained motionless, feeling the weight of every look and every whisper. The sense of power, so present in every aspect of his life, was now just a distant memory, and in that instant he understood the true meaning of what Helena had done. It wasn't revenge, it was karma. The past didn't destroy him with shouts or scandals, but with the calm of someone who knows that the truth, when it arrives, doesn't need to rush. Helena left, and the church door closed behind her with a bang that echoed like a full stop. If this story kept you hooked until the very last second, just imagine what awaits you in the next chapter. Because the next chapter reveals how one secret can span decades and change the fate of an entire family. Like now, subscribe and activate the bell, because you won't want to miss what's coming.